Next on the timeline is Rudy Toombs, and so now we're really in the heart of R&B. We're in the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s, and so when you listen to music written by Rudy Toombs or some of these later artists, it's pretty clearly R&B, although some of them kind of border on rock and roll, and some of them are really blues. So once again, still murky, but you can definitely hear that it's kind of evolved from jump blues, at least, or moved on from jump blues, I should say. So Rudy Toombs grew up in Harlem. He was a tap dancer in the 1930s, and he tried his hand at different performing roles, and eventually he decided to become a songwriter, which was the right move for him. I think he became like a very prolific songwriter. He has over 200 songs that have been documented that he was written. But specifically, he was included in the timeline because of his work with Ruth Brown. He wrote Teardrops from My Eyes, which was a very well-known, famous song by Ruth Brown, and also early R&B. It topped the charts, and he also wrote 5, 10, 15 Hours, which was also one of Ruth Brown's early hits. He wrote some other songs plenty of songs that were hits. One interesting thing is he wrote One Mint, what is it called? One Mint Julep. He wrote that song for the Clovers, and 5, 10, 15 Hours was released in 1952, and that song was also released in 1952. And the only reason that both songs, the only reason One Mint wasn't number one on the charts was because 5, 10, 15 Hours was at the number one spot, so he would have potentially had, 2 number one spots in 1952. And so that kind of just shows how prolific of a songwriter he was. So he wrote more songs for the Clovers. He also wrote for a number of artists. He wrote for some hits for Louis Jordan, the Five Keys, Joe Turner, Freddie King, Little Willie John. So he's probably one of the greater songwriters in the history, especially during this time. Doesn't really get heard a lot. Ruth Brown is very well known, and we'll talk about her in a second. But as far as Rudy Toombs, I think a lot of times, of course, songwriters kind of get pushed in the background. But the reason he was on this timeline was just because of his kind of background influence on a number of artists in the R&B genre, specifically Ruth Brown. And unfortunately, he in 1962 he was in Harlem, and he got mugged and beaten, got beat up at the time, and the injuries, he had got brain damage, and he died shortly after. So his career was also cut short, unfortunately. So even though Ruth Brown is, I guess technically, she's on the timeline, she's mentioned, as the singer of Rudy Toombs songs on the timeline. And as I've said before, I try to give as much credit to the songwriters as possible, and people who really kind of were at the foundation of some of these genres and musical styles. It's not always the case, but at the same time, the reason it was Ruth Brown is because Ruth Brown is one of the best singers in history, and she also had an influence after her music career as well. So I'm not gonna get too much into Ruth Brown's history, but I couldn't just mention Rudy Toombs without mentioning and going over Ruth Brown. Her background was in she was singing spirituals. That's where she started out, and she was a balladeer. She was one of the most popular R&B artists in the 1950s. Of course, as I said before, Rudy Toombs wrote her songs "Tears from My Eyes" and 5, 10, 15 Hours, which were some of her first hits, not necessarily her biggest hits, but some of her first hits. And big R&B artist. And as things kind of shifted a little bit more to rock and roll, she kind of transitioned a little bit more to like a pop, like swing roll, and continued her career for a while there. Specifically, one thing, a famous quote from Ruth Brown was, because if you listen to some of her songs, they really sound like rock and roll. You could definitely make the argument that they are very rock and roll-esque, and I think when you listen to a number of R&B songs during that time period, it's hard to differentiate them between rock and roll. Like if someone called it rock and roll, you probably wouldn't disagree, especially if you are listening to modern R&B. Like if you take a modern R&B song, from like the 90s or later, or even the 80s or later, and you compare it to a Ruth Brown song, and you say, does this sound more like rock and roll or R&B? I think a lot of people would choose rock and roll, but it's up for debate, but something to consider. But one of her famous quotes, she was asked by a journalist, when did rhythm and blues become rock and roll? And she said, when the white kids started dancing to it. And that statement, I think, is something that kind of reflects the music industry through the entire span. Just because, as we talked about with the genres, the genres kind of evolved as, the marketing was appropriate. And so, the rock and roll genre kind of evolved and shifted and became a completely separate genre as the market seemed appropriate. And not necessarily by style, even though, I think there's no doubt that, as rock and roll evolved, it has a clear delineated style, and of course we have all these subgenres of rock that are clearly rock. So, I think it's an important quote just to consider, like, socially and culturally, and just kind of when you take a step back and look at, the timeline and the music, it kind of, it makes sense, for her perspective. And then in the 1980s, she got into a legal suit with Atlantic Records to try to get some of her royalties back. Atlantic Records, of course, was where she released most of her biggest hits in the 1950s. And, this was kind of a general theme. Is, a lot of musicians, pre-1950s especially, they were just trying to break into the industry, especially with some of the backgrounds. If you're coming from impoverished backgrounds, or where a situation where this is make or break, this is really your only avenue for where you can get some sort of economic success. A lot of these musicians were just more or less being taken advantage of. At very least, they were not being paid as you would pay a mainstream artist. So it was a big issue for a lot of black musicians, and it was kind of a landmark case for Ruth Brown to successfully take on Atlantic Records to get some of her royalties back, even though, I think it's pretty consensus that she didn't get enough, but it's a win regardless. And that battle and some of the money related to it. There was seed money related to that, 1.5 million, that allowed her to help start the Rhythm and Blues Foundation, which was to support some of the older musicians who had been around and kind of gone through the same thing. And it was also to provide, just general financial support and basic benefits for just, artists from the present, moving forward.